The climate transition is the way many of these countries or continents will achieve energy security and independence. And by combining these two very important goals, it bolsters our confidence that you'll see more and more favorable climate legislation and policy.
Welcome to Well Said, discussions with investors from across Wellington Management about market and geopolitical cross-currents and the long-term research required to make sense of them. I'm your host, Thomas Mucha. Once a niche area confined to renewable energy, climate investing is now incredibly broad, for the simple fact that climate change is likely to affect almost every corner of the economy. Adding her voice to the mix, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently warned that climate change is likely to impact asset values with contagion, she says, for the entire financial system. And so she urged prompt action on the low-carbon transition. Now, regular listeners of this podcast will also know that I spend a lot of time on the geopolitics of climate change and how it's rapidly intersecting with today's complex national security background. So here to talk about climate change, the energy transition, and the fast-growing climate opportunity set is Alan Hsu, a portfolio manager here at Wellington. Alan has been investing through a climate lens since 2008, a lot longer than most investors, which I suppose makes him a pioneer. So Alan, welcome to Well Said.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's really a delight to be here.
So Alan, you grew up in Houston, Texas, oil country, the son of a petroleum engineer. You saw firsthand then the tremendous power and volatility of energy markets back in the 1980s, the 1990s. So you also know firsthand the outsized exposure to climate risks across Texas, from heat and drought to hurricanes to flooding. So how does your personal background shape your views on climate investing and also on investing in general?
Sure. So as you mentioned, having grown up in Texas, which is the de facto energy hub of the energy sector in North America, and as the son of a petroleum engineer, I did have an up-close view into the ups and downs of the sector. It really made me appreciate the capital intensity as well as the boom and bust cycles associated with energy and really all natural resources. Very importantly, as I got older, it also helped me to recognize how relatively little innovation took place in energy writ large. When you fast forward, when I joined Wellington as an investor, the fundamental backdrop had changed pretty dramatically. Solar, wind, battery technology, energy grid technology were still early days, but there were signs that they were gaining traction and were seemingly inevitably going to take share from traditional sources of energy. The view that we had at the time was that eventually you would relabel your sources of energy, that what was regarded as conventional at the time, which would include oil, coal, natural gas, were inevitably going to be regarded as secondary. And the things that seemed out in the distance, too remote to be commercially successful, were eventually going to become common and primary. And indeed, I think that all trajectories today suggest that that really is the path that we're on.
Yeah, that happened.
That has happened. And technology, policy, regulation, even consumer preferences are all shifting meaningfully to further favor climate-advantaged assets. And I felt that that would open up a multi-year, if not multi-decade opportunity. And that really just relates to my views on the energy sector. When I think about having grown up in Texas, going back, and even thinking about some of the weather dynamics that you allude to, for me, as a child, hurricanes, drought, heat were common. I never really thought of them as being systematic. That's an aspect of climate investing that I've come to further appreciate since I've been with Wellington, and in particular as we have really taken advantage of a lot of the resources and the partnerships that Wellington has, whether it's with Woodwell or MIT, to really understand that those weather anomalies that I experienced as a child were early days and what is likely to be a recurring problem.
Yeah, it's part of a broader trend that's going to be with us forever.
For a long time, yes.
All right, so Alan, before you were a climate investor, you worked in the tech sector, right?
That's right.
So what was the moment when you realized that energy and technology were bound to come together?
I thought the intersection seemed clear right away. That is when I joined the firm. My background in technology was in enterprise software. Beyond being generally a terrific business, software is also a uniquely productivity-enhancing tool. it has incredibly high returns on investment, meaning almost anyone that deploys it sees some kind of benefit. And what we recognized was that it had these incredible benefits, but hadn't been deployed systematically through every facet of the industrial economy, at least not during my time in the sector. So when I decided to pivot my career trajectory and move into professional investing, and I was fortunate enough to join Wellington and was given a chance to express which area would you want to focus on, where would you want to center your career, I knew instantly that I wanted to focus on this intersection of energy and technology under this premise or this observation that energy was a very large, very important sector that had arguably spent very little time on innovation, very little capital on innovation and R&D and in change, not just for years, Thomas, but for decades.
So tech was coming for energy.
Again, you wouldn't have been able to make that statement at every point in the last 40 years, but at the point at which I joined the firm, when you began to see the signs that solar and wind, albeit still nascent, albeit still relatively new technologies, if they were going to follow adoption curves and technology improvement curves that you had seen unfold in multiple other sectors, it seemed inevitable that these types of technologies were going to continue to grow and be deployed and ultimately to take share. And that was what I had seen firsthand working in technology, the power of adding data, analytics, software, new combinations of hardware to create dispersion of outcomes within a sector. So my view at the time was this intersection of technology, energy seemed inevitable, and it was really going to have an impact in the conventional energy sector.
All right, let's dig deeper into the nuts and bolts of what climate investment really means. So we've seen the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's the Repower EU, among other bits of legislation here and there. I think all of this underscores and probably accelerates the massive amount of capital that's already in motion here. The International Energy Agency estimates that $2 trillion will be invested every year on clean energy alone, at least through the end of this decade. Some countries, including China, have begun to lower their carbon intensity, decoupling emissions from GDP through efficiency gains, more use of renewables, electric vehicles, and on and on. So beyond this renewable energy piece of this, Alan, what else rounds out this, let's call it enormous opportunity set?
Climate investing seems to mean different things to different people. For us, climate investing is very simply investing in companies that are materially positioned to create value by solving the problems associated with climate. So for us, it's not about necessarily having a low carbon portfolio or not just owning companies that have really low scope 1 through 3 scores. There's nothing wrong with those approaches, but that's not how we think about climate investing. So I'll say again, it's companies that create economic and stakeholder value through products and services that either decarbonize, drive resource efficiency, enhance climate resilience, or help to reprice climate risks.
That's a broad set.
It's a relatively broad opportunity set. And that actually, Thomas, is, in my mind, one of the underappreciated aspects of climate investing is that although energy is arguably the single most important total addressable market, it's by no means the only one. And when you think about the idea of what's now become popular as a term is energy transition, but you broaden that a little bit and you think about a climate transition, you begin to get a sense for just how large the opportunity set. And that's something that is important to emphasize is that when you think about the world's physical infrastructure, they represent a collection of different systems, each comprised of interconnected assets. Every one of these systems, whether it's energy, electricity, food and agriculture, transportation, have been underinvested in for the past several decades. And what's so powerful about climate investing for us is that all of them now are being renovated, updated, improved, reconfigured, redesigned, but all of it with a really strong emphasis on sustainability and efficiency. And that really does play into the way that we think about climate investing. So important to emphasize, it's not just about renewable energy. It really is this climate transition that encompasses the world's physical assets. And for the first time, you have an enormous amount of capital, to your point, several trillions of dollars that are being devoted to upgrading all of these systems.
Right, so the broad societal, economic, political impacts are going to be pretty significant here.
That's right. And you did mention a lot of the legislation that we've seen emerge from places such as the EU and the United States, whether it's the Repower EU or the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think if we take a small step back, Much of the legislation that you reference really took shape following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And recall at the time how much of the focus, beyond the obvious humanitarian crisis, revolved around the resources at risk. And it wasn't just the oil and the natural gas. It turns out that Russia, Ukraine are responsible for much of the world's critical agriculture as well as metals and precious metals resources. And I think that that really woke policymakers up to this idea that you needed to ensure that we were not overly dependent on what were ultimately unreliable partnerships. And so when you look at the legislation in both the EU as well as the US that's been crafted since that invasion, it seems very clear to us that as much of the focus is on energy security as it is on climate. Said another way, the climate transition is the way many of these countries or continents will achieve energy security and independence. And by combining these two very important goals, it bolsters our confidence that you'll see more and more favorable climate legislation and policy.
Yeah, I completely agree. The conversations that I've had with policymakers across the board in Brussels, in Washington, Berlin, everywhere, the Russia conflict really was a wake-up call, and it really did focus policymakers in visceral ways on energy security, economic security, and those two things are linked.
That's right. And at a time when you can seldom find true bipartisan goals, it feels as though this idea of energy security and the recognition that climate transition is the way to achieve that does seem to be much more common.
Alan, I've heard you mention a heuristic that I think is a helpful way of looking at climate investing and these market inefficiencies that you've just highlighted. It's this idea of true positives versus false negatives, and true negatives versus false positives. So first, what do you mean by that? And why do you think that's a useful lens? And maybe give us a few examples.
There has been a proliferation of strategies that maybe you could loosely categorize as sustainability or climate or carbon or impact or responsible or ESG investing that effectively quantifies or identifies what a company's footprint looks like today on some metric. And none of these things is bad. But the problem from my perspective is that those are still ultimately relatively blunt tools. And very importantly, unlike other steps in an investment process, those types of tools prioritize what companies look like today. Whereas as investors, most of the time, we're taught to effectively try to look out a little bit in the future and discount not just all future cash flows, but the types or the quality of the assets that drive those future cash flows. And that means you have to be able to, while recognizing the importance of today, really have more of an opinion on what happens tomorrow. This construct of false positive or true negatives is because you have, in some cases, companies that are maybe not ideal today. They don't check all of the boxes. They may not meet all of the materiality thresholds. They may not have the most impressive ESG scores, but you can have a judgment based on your interaction with company management, based on your research, that while they may not be an ideal high-scoring ESG or impact or climate credentialed company today, you can have some sense that tomorrow they will be. False negatives would be, let's just say as an example, a car company that doesn't have all of their sales coming from electric vehicles. But we believe by 2030, they'll be able to engineer that transition and they'll be successful in doing so. And by the way, the market is giving you an opportunity to buy them at a single-digit multiple. Literally, you're almost being paid to take the risk that that company can successfully transition. But if they don't meet all the criteria today, then you're not able to buy those stocks. And then a true negative, of course, would be a company that might be saying that they're going to be undergoing a lot of capital allocation or investment shifts in order to capture some of this climate transition opportunity, but really it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of that business. There might be companies in conventional energy that, yes, they have to devote a little bit more of their capex to investing in alternative energy, but it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of the business model. And I think that you see these types of false negatives or true negatives or false positives in the marketplace frequently. And where that nets out for you as an investor is it does impact capital allocation. It does impact where you're able to devote your dollars, because you don't want to, as a professional investor, report to your stakeholders that this portfolio owns companies that don't check all of the boxes. And yet, in many cases, those companies could be doing much, much more for the environment than most of their peers or most of the investment universe. That's the type of misallocation that can occur if you're optimizing for some of these metrics that don't really capture this idea of false positives, false negatives, etc.
That's fascinating. And one of the things that interests me about this type of investing is if you look at the history of investing, we're so used to looking back at data to extrapolate towards the future. And you can't do that with climate investing.
Very difficult.
There is no past because we haven't lived through climate change. So we have to use the future to predict the future. And so I think we all have to sort of change our thinking about, well, what drives investment, what drives short, medium, long-term thinking. So thank you. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Now, let's dig into the research a little bit here more. Wellington partners with the Woodwell Climate Research Center. You alluded to that before. We also partner with the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. All this is to study climate risk, both from physical and transition risk perspectives. So how do these collaborations that we have help you approach your own work?
It's a terrific question, Thomas, and one we get often. I would say, in very simple terms, as much as possible in investing, for me, it helps to have North Stars. And for us, incorporating the climate science has become one of those North Stars. And the reason for this is because it helps to extend our time horizons and to recognize where you should be focused for the long term, not just how you position a portfolio, but how you position your research efforts, where you dig in, where you think there's going to be interesting ideas. So a simple example would have been a few years ago, by working with both our internal climate science team as well as our colleagues at Woodwell, we recognized that agriculture was going to be a very important theme for a climate portfolio. And the reason for this is because much of the world's agriculture productivity today occurs in areas that are basically proximate to the equator. And that's because today that climate is relatively favorable to grow. And so if you think about where most of the world's vegetables, fruit, wheat, soy, rice, millet, grains are produced, it's areas like Southern California, Northern Brazil, and Northern Africa, Southeast Asia. Well, working with Woodwell, we recognized that those climate conditions, which are favorable today, can pivot pretty dramatically to make that type of agriculture productivity much more difficult. You have rising temperatures, greater episodes of drought, greater episodes of intense rainfall, which can damage crop productivity. That helped us to recognize that we needed to focus on companies that were producing products and services that delivered some form of agriculture resilience. And working with our global industry analysts that are focused on agriculture and industrial goods, we began to identify the short list of global companies that we felt met the criteria from a thematic perspective, from a valuation perspective, from a scores well on ESG perspective. That's the nature of the collaboration here, but that's a very good example for us of how working with Woodwell helped alert us to an insight that we probably wouldn't have otherwise had into an important area that we think is not just critical for the next couple of years, but for the next couple of decades.
That's so interesting because everything you just pointed out also helps support my own geopolitical analysis. I've used these same insights from Woodwell. Climate change in general is quickly rising to the top of the agenda for governments, for militaries, for all the national security officials around the world that I talk to. The Pentagon, of course, is concerned about how climate change in these equatorial and tropical regions in particular is going to impact climate migration, as you say, food and water scarcity issues. They're expecting more resource conflicts, more political extremism, more failed states, rising health and pandemic issues. These are just some of the coming climate challenges. So in your view, Alan, how does this, let's call it systemic focus, on national security and climate change affect the future of this investment opportunity set?
Thomas, I've learned a lot about this dynamic from you, and my view is that the geopolitical angle is just going to reinforce the feedback loop that policymakers get about the need to continue to focus on climate. And it doesn't mean that there's going to be a direct line between an insight stemmed or born out of geopolitics to policy or legislation that promotes climate investing. But I think as policymakers broadly, whether they're in DC or elsewhere, recognize that there is another really important angle that drives the need to solve some of these problems, it will create this feedback loop that, again, just as energy security has done for climate transition, gives me confidence that this is an area that will continue to see favorable and, I dare say, bipartisan support.
Absolutely. I think that once national security becomes the dominant way of thinking, and that's where we are in this world, it helps force through these ideas and really is taking root. And it's just another very powerful argument that policymakers were making already. But I agree. I think it's going to accelerate the focus on adaptation, on mitigation, on the energy transition across the board.
That's right.
So speaking of the future, and I want to begin to wrap up this conversation, I'm curious to know about how you're thinking about what's coming down the road here. What are some of these climate tech, new innovations coming that we're not really thinking about? What's out there that the markets haven't really considered?
It's a great question, and we're lucky, Thomas, as you know, here at Wellington, we do have many investment professionals that are focused on what is happening in the private markets. And I think, again, it's a reason to be so excited about climate investing broadly, but also to be able to do that at a place like Wellington. As you know, their whole remit is to identify a lot of these technologies before it's obvious in public markets. And I do think that all the technologies they're identifying will eventually impact the public markets, which is why we collaborate with them. They'll either make their way in public markets in the form of a standalone public company that IPOs, or it'll be technology that's purchased and then integrated into some other industrial conglomerate. So either way, it makes sense and is beneficial to look. I can tell you that they have looked at everything from factory automation technology to hydroponic farming to utility smart grid technology to community solar, better recyclable materials, packaging. It's a very large mandate and a very large opportunity set. I don't know that there's any one breakthrough that they're looking at, but that's okay. I think that sometimes we can mislead ourselves into thinking that breakthrough technologies are the only way to tackle this. And of course, it would be fantastic to have a single breakthrough technology, and maybe it comes in the area of nuclear fusion or something like that down the road where you can do it modularly, you can do it very safe. Maybe it comes in things like room temperature semiconducting material. I think there are those types of breakthroughs looming and that are out there that we should continue to pursue. But in the absence of that, collectively, we should not take our eyes off the reality that you can cobble together a lot of very impressive technologies and continue down the path of making solar cheaper and improving the energy density of batteries, improving the range of electric vehicles, reducing the extractive footprint to get lithium. All of these things will combine to make this energy and climate transition much more economically feasible, better for consumers, and ultimately better for the climate.
So let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yes. Said better, yes.
Taking your investor hat off for a moment, and this is more of a philosophical rather than investment type question. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to get climate change under control? Not just for the sake of markets and financial systems, but really for humanity in general, as well as for all the complex ecosystems that exist on this planet.
I think for me, I've recognized the importance of approaching this as an optimist. And that doesn't mean blind to many of the harsh realities, blind to some of the limitations. But I think if you're not approaching this from a perspective of optimism, it can quickly lead you to a posture of inaction. There are many, many very good ideas out there. There is a significant amount of progress that's being made in public markets that are very visible, but also in private markets that are less visible. And these improvements, innovations, et cetera, can have a material impact on reaching where we need to be from an atmospheric perspective, from a CO2 perspective, to get, as you say, climate under control. Is it going to be difficult? Yes. Is the challenge going to be daunting? Yes. But I believe with human ingenuity and capital deployed in the right ways intelligently, I do think that this is something that we can tackle.
I completely agree. Optimism is the way to go, and human history shows that we can solve almost any problem that's put in front of us, especially if we deploy capital in the right ways. So we're grateful that you're out there on the front lines doing it for us, Alan. So once again, thanks for joining us. Alan Hsu, Portfolio Manager here at Wellington.
My pleasure, Thomas. Thank you.
The Well Said podcast is produced by Wellington Management The executive producer is Kristen Ganong. Our senior producers are Mark Murphy, Dana Wickstead, and Colin Hopkins. Our sound engineer is Mark Murphy. This episode is mixed and edited by Mark Murphy. You can find this episode, as well as others, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past results are not a reliable indicator of future results. Forward-looking statements should not be considered as guarantees or prediction of future events. This material was current as of the publication date. Wellington assumes no duty to update the content in the event that the information changes. This commentary is provided for informational purposes only. It is not research that is required to be prepared in accordance with legal requirements designed to promote the independence of investment research, and it is not subject to any prohibition on dealing ahead of the dissemination of investment research. It should not be viewed as current or past recommendation and is not intended to constitute investment advice or an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any securities. It does not take into account the investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Wellington Management does not provide legal, tax, or accounting advice. The views expressed are those of the speaker and may not reflect the views of others at Wellington. This recording may not be reproduced or distributed in whole or in part for any purpose without the express written consent of Wellington Management. Please refer to the disclosure section of this podcast for complete details.